Yes. So my name is Stephanie King, and I am a childbirth educator and doula, but I'm also an online course creator. So you found me through the podcast. I have a top rated podcast for birth. It's called Pregnancy and Birth Made Easy. And then my company, or the name of the birth course too, is My Essential Birth. So it's online birth education, and I get to serve women all over the world doing that. I'm also a mom of five, and I'm really active in my church, follower of Christ. You know, faith is a big part of my journey as well. I think that's why I was drawn to you. You talk about that a lot with your business and stuff. Yeah, so I guess that's a little bit about me. We've kind of lived all over the world. My husband's been military. We're now in Florida and loving it. Like, absolutely love it. We're like, I think we're tropical people. We just give us the humidity and the heat and the sun and the storms. Yeah, we're pretty happy where we're at right now. So
Yes, I love that. Yeah, so let's talk though about your journey. So, like you said, you are an online educator, you're a course creator. The main thing you are selling in your business is online courses, but you started as a service provider working as a doula. So, literally, like being with women when they are giving birth, which I had a doula with both my births and like highly recommend like having someone there, that support person is so huge. But how did you go from the decision of like being a service provider as a doula to moving to education through your course and podcast?
yes. So I actually started with childbirth education, and that's because it was my first step into helping other women while I was also at home with my babies. So after I
Okay.
had my third birth, and that was a home birth, and it changed my life, which you can listen to all about my story right on the podcast. But I had my third baby at home, and it was a game changer. And I was like, all the odds were against me, and I did this. And if I can do this, anybody can do this. Like, I felt so empowered and excited to share it with other moms. So I'm like, how do I do that? And so we took our next tax return that we had. Like, we're like poor. My husband's, going through school or whatever. We're sharing a house with his parents, like renting a house with his parents so that we can afford to survive while he's finishing up schooling and stuff. We've got three little babies. So we take our whole tax return, and I went and got certified to be able to do childbirth education out of my home. And then one of the things that they recommended was attending a birth. So I like put it up on a birth forum. I would love to attend a birth, totally free. It's for the certification. And of course, I fell in love because I was like, well, that's the next step. I have to figure out how to do this too. But yes, I started teaching birth courses, and that quickly led to doula work. And then what was interesting is I had connected with another childbirth educator, and we were kind of talking about, what's frustrating is the schedule that we're doing doesn't necessarily work for parents all the time. And so all the people that want to come can't come, or I'm only offering it this many weeks. My house only fits this many students. Like, sometimes I either have to run a second class that's not as full, or on a second night when that takes away from my family, or people aren't able to take this course at this time for me. So I was actually running into some good problems that a business owner would have, whereas like I need to be able to offer this to more people more often. So that's kind of what sparked that idea. But it was another childbirth educator that came to me, and we were business partners together. Her name's Courtney. And she approached me, and she's like, what do you think about, bringing something online? And I do believe that, this is how our Father in heaven works. This idea had been planted just a couple weeks prior, where I was looking over the content of what I was teaching. And by that time, I'd been doing it for a couple years, and I had really expanded it at that point because I had all this knowledge. I had taken these other trainings. I had attended all these births. And so what I was teaching them was all of the core content that I was required to teach. And then they were getting all this bonus content from my knowledge and experience. And I remember reading through the content, and I'm like, there's so much more that I have to offer. And, if I could redo this, this is what I would do. And then she approached me. So it was kind of just succession of what was supposed to happen. And even at the time, I was in my first semester of midwifery school because, right, that's the natural next step to getting involved with birth work. But it was taking a lot of my time. And I remember looking over at my little guys playing on the floor, and I'm like, I'm going to lose all these years. Like, they need me here at home right now. And so I had just contacted the college and said, I can't do this right now, but thank you. And that's when Courtney reached out to me. And so that was kind of what happened there. And then I didn't want to do it at first, but I prayed about it. And then it became this big, like, okay, yeah, I have to do it. So that was
My
how it
gosh,
came about.
yes, what a beautiful story. And yeah, like God working in both of you to like make that become a thing. And I remember I've heard you talk on your podcast before actually about almost becoming a midwife. And it's like, well, we'll get into this, but you're a homeschool mom of a lot of kids. It's like, yeah, you're
Yeah.
able to work your business into that, which may not have been the case had you become a midwife. That's really cool. So when you were teaching the birth classes, birth education in person, how are people finding you guys to take classes from?
So we had certified through somewhere that they put our stuff on their website. So that was one way. I got very few students that way, though. The majority of my
Yeah.
students, it was the hustle of like, I'm going to go to every birth center. I'm going to start attending any birth meetings. I'm going to show up at La Leche League so that people can tell their friends. If there were like homeschool meetings nearby where kids got together for play groups and stuff, I talked about it there. I went to any kind of like birth get together. They had like a showing of the business of being born. Like I went to that, any kind of birth stuff. I showed up and I made cards and I talked to people. And so it was really just networking that got people into my classes. And then once that was going, then it became word of mouth. So it was a little both. But that hustle in the beginning, I guess, is probably what did it.
Yeah, well, and you're right too. That's like with like the online course, like, yeah, people can take it literally anytime. I know for me, when I took your course, I listened to a lot of it like on the go when I was doing other things. That is so huge and a different thing from having to go like sit at a specific time in a classroom learning something. Okay, so when you guys came together, you and Courtney, and said like, okay, we're going to do this thing, we're going to do birth education together. What happened next? Did y'all make the course first, or you start the podcast first? What was that flow like?
Yeah, we made the course first. So if you're listening here, don't do that. If you're going to be creating something, you need to have a way of people being excited about it before it launches. Because I remember early on, I think it was Rachel Hollis that I was listening to, and she said something about like, I thought just by writing this book and putting it out there that people were just going to be like throwing their money at me like I need this thing. And I'm like, well, that's so silly. Like, who would do that? Who thinks that? And then we create this course and we were like, this is so good. Like people are going to love this. And we launched it to nobody, and like nobody there to buy it. And I like had that moment where I was like, oh, that's what she was talking about. Like I did not connect the dots. So, but yes, we created the course first. We had a very clear vision of what we wanted to do. And that included the quality of the content, but also the quality of the video. Like if you've seen our stuff, it's very well professionally done. We also went into a lot of debt over that, which I highly recommend you do not do. Like this is like we had our vision and we completed that vision, but we did all the things that you could do wrong. We did that the wrong way. But yeah, so that's the course went first, and then after we launched it, and nobody was interested in what we had because they didn't know about it. And we like beta tested and we did discounts and all kinds of stuff. Like we didn't have a social media following, nothing. Then we started the birth course. So that came about 6 months later. And you may have heard some of that story before, but when we launched it, a couple hundred people, right, within the first month, like those were our downloads. And then the next month was a little bit more. But because we had taken out all of that debt, and I mean like we were probably at least $20,000 in debt at that point for creating the course, which is so silly. We were at a point where the credit cards were not able to pay the other credit cards. So we were using debt to pay debt, hoping that the birth course was going to start selling. And when that didn't happen, I remember having this place of, Courtney, I'm going to have to pull out. Like we're going to have to, if I have to start pulling money from my family every month, this business isn't going to work. I have to go back to what I was doing that was actually bringing in money. And so I, very prayerfully was like, Heavenly Father, what do you want me to do? Because this has the opportunity of like really making things hard on our family right now. And I had a dream. It was a really neat, those like 3 a.m. spiritual experience where you got to get up and write it all down and all of that. And it was a really clear, like, keep going and it will get better. And I think it was the next month. So I think that was like July. I was deciding like in August that I wasn't going to be able to do this anymore if we couldn't make enough sales to cover the debt. And in August, that was the very first time that we made enough sales to cover the debt payment. And then we always made enough sales to cover the debt and then some from that point. So anyways, I definitely I hope people learn from that mistake. Like you should not have to go into debt to create. It's not that you don't make sacrifices, and it's not that you don't pull money from your family to be able to invest in yourself and create a business, but you do not have to go into debt to be able to create what you have in mind. And there is a slow process. Like I'd said, we didn't have to do that professional video and all of these things that we really went just head first into. We really could have built it up as we were taught to do in the course that we took that taught us how to create courses and launch them. We really could have done those, like, let's build our social media while we're creating the course. Let's start the podcast while so we're building this momentum. Let's offer some freebies, and then let's offer a $47 offer so it starts paying for some ads. There's like a process that you take, and we didn't do that. So I hope people learn from that.
Yes. And that, well, gosh, okay. Yeah, beautiful story. And I did not know that full part of your story. I knew that you've shared with me about going into debt to make the course originally. But yeah, that's crazy to hear how much. And thanks for sharing that. Cause I do think some people wonder, like, hey, how much does it cost to record a like completely professionally recorded course like that? And it is such a common mistake. I had that same mistake too, not with the debt part, but with making an offer and having not an audience to sell it to. With the first time I made a product, it was like, I was like, yeah, this product's awesome. And then it was like, wait, I haven't built a social following or an email list to sell this to. So you do, like, it's a common mistake. You live and you learn. I'm curious if you were to like redo it. I know you kind of alluded to this already, but like, would you, I guess, start the podcast first and then make the course filmed with slides at home and recording it yourself? Or would you still do the professional recording the first time, but just start with the podcast first? Like if you were to give advice to someone about it.
Yeah, I think that would be a preference and kind of where your budget is at. I could see it going either way. But I think it makes complete sense that while you are just getting started and to not have to spend a bunch of money in the beginning to, yes, start some kind of social following, whether you're going to choose Instagram to be your thing or you have a blog or you have a podcast, whatever you're going to use to grab your email list and nourish them every week, whatever you're going to use for that, and then create the content while you're doing it and do something that is cheap and accessible and also like full of really great content. It's going to match the information that you're giving out in all those places for free. And then when you have money that has come in and you're making money and you can put some away, then you re-record, with a better camera or you hire somebody. And also there's lessons to be learned once you start recording too, because part of the reason it costs us so much is because that first time that we recorded, and I look back at it now as I'm making updates and I'm like, man, we didn't know what we were doing. We did a pretty good job, but also we didn't know what we were doing. And so because of that, we had to do a second, we had to hire them again for a second day because we're like, shoot, we missed this and this and this. And we should have caught that the first time. And so hiring them twice and 2 times of editing, it gets expensive.
Yeah, and hard to update too, I guess, because then you have to like go back to like the professional studio, I guess. Like how have you been able to update the course? And I know you're about to completely update it, but like before that
totally. No, like the updating that I've done has really kind of been like in the resource section, or I'll do, the podcast episodes are really like, hey students, check out these episodes. These are for you, that kind of thing. But no, and I felt really intimidated by it because we did it so professionally the first time. So I just shared with you and for your listeners to hear, like before we started chatting here, I actually this time hired a videographer that I met with on Zoom, and he helped me go over my space and how I could make it really nice and clean and pretty for creating kind of a set. And then also we talked about lighting and cameras and sound. So now that I have all of that set up, which I definitely invested in that, I probably spent about $6,000 worth just for the equipment to be able to grab everything that I'm going to need to have in my home. And then I'll be able to send all of that really great quality equipment to an editor, and then they can take care of the editing for me. But instead of, I was going to hire him to come in and professionally do this, but I'm like, you know what? I want to be able to do updates as needed, and I don't want to have to feel like I got to drop $1,500 every time I want to update so I can record another 3 to 6 hours. It just gets a little crazy. So, and we move so much, we've been moving so much that I'm like, I need to be able to take studio stuff with me. I just need to be able to do it in my own home, and that's totally realistic when you're recording courses online.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And you being a busy working mom, it's nice for you to not have to like set aside like 2 days or 3 days or whatever to do it all, but more do it on your own time. As you have energy and excitement around a topic, and then you have all the stuff there. Like you're saying, you send it off to someone that does feel like, yeah, like a really good fit. And okay, like, so spoiler stuff for everyone, but like you went from this story where you're saying you launched the birth course and there was no one there to buy it, which is like so crazy to me, because like now you've had over 1,500 students, and it might actually more than that. We were struggling a little bit on finding your stats exactly.
Figure that out.
But we were talking before, we're like, how many students does Stephanie had? No one knows. A lot though. Yeah. And over 2.29 million podcast downloads. So just like incredible, going from, hey, I'm not sure they want to buy this, to all these students, and having such a like top ranked pregnancy and birth podcast. I'm curious, just to kind of pivot for a moment to talking about the podcast. You have grown a really successful podcast. I mean, again, for anyone who's pregnant or thinking about birth and like interested in learning that stuff, I can't recommend your podcast enough. It's so easy to listen to, engaging, really, really informative. I'm curious what tips you have for growing that podcast listener base the way you have, that you could translate to someone else's business.
Yeah, I think if you are really educated in whatever you're teaching, and you make it fun and interesting, then you'll have access to all kinds of people. The other thing that I think we talked about though was the titling of the podcast. So I was telling you just before we got on here, I've used like a podcast headline analyzer, for example. So you can like Google that and find some free analyzers. And so you type stuff in and they say, make it longer, make it more personal, use these kinds of words. And so you like fix it and it gets longer and all this stuff. And that's great. It's fine. But when I was looking just the other day on podcast and I was like, I wanted to see where my podcast was for if somebody typed in unmedicated birth, or if they typed in birth, or if they typed in epidural, does it show up? Because the truth is, when you're typing those things up, if it doesn't pop up right away, like really quick on something in the first couple of podcasts, people aren't going to see it. They're probably not going to go searching for too long for something like that. So you want it to hit those things. And I'm realizing like some of these headline analyzers or whatever, while they might work for other niches or other topics, I don't know that that's how people are going to find what I'm putting out there and what I'm looking for. So I will say that as you start your podcast, like the first few are probably going to feel so uncomfortable, and they might even sound so awful. Like we recorded 3 to begin with when Courtney and I started this, and the first one was so bad that we could not put it up. And so the second one refers to the first one, and people had asked us about it, and we're like, it doesn't matter. It doesn't exist. It was so bad. It can't exist, So I think you have to be prepared for that. But I think deciding to what kind of like one of the things that I absolutely loved about having Courtney working with me when we did the podcast, and maybe you loved it too, is when you're listening to those, it's like you are sitting at a table listening to your best friends talk about birth, and you just feel like you're learning at the same time. And we were goofy and fun, and I loved having somebody to host with me. When I had to switch over to solo, because we're not in the business together anymore, we still have a good relationship, but I have the business and she does not, and I had to switch to solo. That was so hard. And I was like, I'm like, that's what I loved about our podcast. I wanted people to just come sit and listen and all this. And so I really had to pretend like I was talking to a friend. I'm talking to a friend about birth, and this is, the conversation that we're going to have. And so, I mean, I wish I had, I think it really depends on your audience. Like once you understand who your ideal customer is, and you are talking to that person, just like they tell you to do when you're doing social media or you're writing them an email for a week or a blog post, then it becomes a lot easier to kind of create content for that. But understanding what the pain points are, again, just like you do with social media, or you do with a freebie, or you do with your course creation, understanding what those pain points are or what somebody's going to be curious about in regards to that topic. Those are the things that I think stand out the most when it comes to podcasting. Like I'd be curious to hear even from you, Liz, while we're talking, what were the things that you were searching for on the podcast and what caught your attention? What was something that you listened to first?
Yeah, on your podcast?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I really can't remember exactly how I found you. I think it's because I probably typed in something really generic, actually, like pregnancy podcast or birth, or even natural birth. And then you would have been one that popped up quickly. I think I probably explored a few different podcasts and then was like, oh, I like this one the most. I'm going to like listen to all of them. And then ultimately, I feel like I followed your customer journey in the way you would hope people would, of like listening to the podcast, downloading your main freebie, getting your emails behind the birth course, like, and then continuing to listen to the podcast, as like, and taking the entire birth course. Yeah. And it's so cool hearing like how that journey for you guys, starting with 3 episodes and feeling like they weren't great at first, was that such a true thing. I felt that same way about my first 3. And it is a good point of like the pivot from having a co-host to not, because it is a different dynamic. And when you're solo, you almost have to like pretend like there is another person there, like you're saying, like really visualize more that person on the other end that you're talking to. I wanted to ask you too about your podcast. So you do not have sponsors. on your podcast.
No.
But you could have sponsors because you have a very high download amount. Like you probably get paid really well actually to do sponsors. You're also super niche. So there's a lot of like potential pros of having sponsors. What made you make the decision to only promote your own stuff versus having sponsors and promoting your own stuff?
Yeah, I was going back and forth with that. In fact, I think it was probably about this time last year where I was considering maybe putting some sponsors on and also adding some affiliate stuff to it. But I realized, like, honestly, just kind of like crunching the numbers and looking at what made sense financially, but also for my listeners, because I'm like, what's going to benefit them the most too. That's when I decided I don't think that's best. And actually, I had gone to there was some kind of podcast thing. Of course, I'm not going to remember. It was like a podcast conference or something that I had gone to last year. And I was invited there because of the high downloads and whatever else. And so I got like a free ticket, and it happened to be like in Orlando here in Florida. And I'm like, okay, that's not too far away. I'll go check it out. And I talked with all kinds of the vendors that they had there. And in speaking to several of them, they were like, yeah, you shouldn't be doing sponsorships. You shouldn't be doing affiliates. Like everything should link back to this. And they showed me kind of like numbers wise why that made sense. And I was like, yeah, I guess that's kind of my final straw with it. Like it makes the most sense to really promote my own products, and it makes the most sense for the listeners too. So that's what we do.
Yeah, I love that. Well, and it is, I feel like we can feel as podcasters, and I'm sure listeners can feel this too, of like, you know, a thing you're often told that I really push back against in Podcast Success Blueprint, but like you're told that like the only way to make money podcasting is to get ads on your podcast or affiliate stuff like you're saying. But like you make great money from your podcast being the top of funnel by just selling your own stuff, which is the thing you also have the most control over and probably also has the highest ROI. Like you might get like $20 back or a free product for an affiliate thing, but then like your own stuff is more expensive, higher value. So yeah, I think it's a smart, and you're like you're saying, it kind of the experience of the listener too. So that's something I've appreciated about the way you do things, of just kind of like showing people that like it doesn't have to be that way, and that's not necessarily the only way to make money from your podcast.
I was going to say, I think it depends on your clients too, because like I know my ideal customer, they're young families. And so they're having to decide like between my course price right now or this really kind of fun thing that I have on, on my podcast there that maybe is only $30 or $40 for them. But for them, that's a big deal. And so they might have to choose between buying my birth course right now or like getting this fun thing that I get 10% of their $40 purchase or whatever it is. And then maybe they can't afford it until the next month, or maybe, then they find something else. So I think it depends on your customers too. Like if it matches really well with what you're already offering and it's not going to affect them financially or like affect a decision that they're making, are they going to have to purchase something you have or this other thing, then I think that would totally change that conversation.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, it's like a competing product really for you to like recommend other stuff potentially. Yeah. Another thing too that's unique about your business, and the podcast, links to this, but like you have to attract a new listener and then therefore also like a new customer at like the exact right time in their life, which is that's different from a lot of listeners. But some people listening do have that same situation, right? Like for you, it's like maybe someone who's trying to conceive or already pregnant or in postpartum for your postpartum course, but it's like outside of that time frame, they're really probably not an ideal listener or customer. So how do you feel like that changes the way you market?
The nice thing about that, with it being pregnancy and women being so involved in that experience in their life, is they really go searching within those 9 months. They are searching for everything. They want to learn all the things. How big is my baby this week? Why do I have this symptom? And then as it gets closer, maybe with like, I always say this, right? Like maybe with the second babies, that's really where people, I think, start researching a little bit earlier. Not everybody. Some people dive in right away with first baby, and I absolutely love that. But a lot of times it really is those second babies. But so if like a lot of my first time moms, it's like they're finding me like, I don't know, 30, 32 weeks. I'll have people jump in 35, 37 weeks. And it's because it's like, we've ignored it long enough. And now all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, baby has to come out. There's no escaping this. There's no getting around it. So I better look into it. And then it all kind of goes along with that. Like we can talk about kind of the lead magnet that I use right now. And I'm probably going to be adding another one or switching that up in some way. because it might not be for everybody during birth and stuff. But something that was told to me, I think I had at one point, I had hired somebody to do some ads, and they were the same people that were recording my podcast at the time. And so I was like, yeah, sure, let's give it a try. It was fine. I wouldn't do it again. Lesson learned. But they told me, they're like, your people turn over like every 9 weeks because of that, because of the fact that it is pregnancy, and because it's so, they're like, usually maybe it's like 6 months or whatever, however many, but they're like every 9 weeks, like 6 to 9 weeks, you like have new people looking at your stuff, and this is why. And so I was like, well, that's actually really valuable because it gives me an opportunity to reuse content more often, but also like put it into new light, say it a little bit differently or something like that. And so that was helpful with me and especially when you get started, like with podcasting, I don't know if you felt this way, but I'm like, oh my gosh, like I'm 6 episodes in and I feel like I've shared everything. I don't know, like I'm out. I don't have anything else to say, and now we're coming up to like 300 episodes at this point. And you're like, no, you could talk all day about this. And there's actually stuff to say all the time. But it is helpful to know, like, yeah, how often your audience switches over and then how you talk to them. I do sprinkle in some postpartum stuff. You've seen that. And now I have a postpartum course, which was kind of what women in the birth course were asking for. So it's really important to listen to your audience. But as far as like talking to current customers, it's really like I have that ideal customer in my head, and I talk to her all day long. And I talk to her as if she's always this pregnant, or I talk to her, for her first trimester or for her second trimester. And that's just the conversation that we have back and forth. And as long as I'm talking to that one person, then everything else kind of flows.
Oh, that's so smart. And yeah, the reusing content, like, oh my gosh, I had not even thought about that angle for your business, of how it is like, you're always turning over in a sense who's coming and discovering you, and they are always in the same place, generally speaking, of like being pregnant or postpartum or trying to conceive potentially. With the reusing, actually, let's talk about this. With your podcast, like you said, you're close to 300 episodes, so like a lot. Do you feel like people go back and listen to the early episodes when they first discover you? Or do you feel like I have to like talk about the same topics again in a new light? Do you ever re-air old episodes because of people not going all the way back? How do you handle that?
That's a great question. I have people who are like diehards, right? Who they're like, I've listened to every episode and I think I listened to them twice. And you're like, that's amazing. Because right. Because there's over 200. Like that's a ton of episodes to listen to. Good for you. And then you have people who they'll just catch like a topic that they need here and there, and they start listening and they love it. And then they listen from that point on. So it's just, it's a matter of like talking to them, like I said, wherever they're at. But I do think I cover enough topics that it breeds curiosity in the rest of the experience. So if I'm talking about induction, or I'm talking about being over 35 when you go into labor or whatever, that conversation is going to hold true for the majority of listeners. It's going to pique their interest enough that they're like, I need more information. And so whether that's they're looking for more information on the podcast, or now it's time to jump into the birth course, so, Price is Right or whatever, or they go on the website and they read through like all the different topics. Like, I love the way she talked about these 2 topics. I would love for her to put that, really nice and clean in an organized fashion. I think they come in different places, but either way, when you're talking to that ideal customer, no matter what, like if you can have that good conversation with them, then they're going to have some kind of interest in something, whatever else you have to offer that's going to make their life easier. And oftentimes, that can be in the form of a birth course or a course, an online course.
Yeah, with that, what do you feel like, how do you, sorry, let me start over my question. How do you move people from the podcast to the birth course? Like, how are you kind of talking about it, Sally? Because that's a mistake I think a lot of people can make is they start a podcast. Maybe they have a course or a product of another type that they're hoping to promote for their podcast, but then they never talk about it. So then it's like people are just like, oh my gosh, this free stuff's great. But they don't realize there's necessarily a second thing you have to tell them. And you have to remember too, a lot of people don't look at your show notes. They are literally just listening to the audio. And I feel like you do an excellent job of like pushing the birth course in a way that does not feel like, oh, she just wants my money or anything like that. It feels more like, oh my gosh, I'm like, this is really helpful. I know this thing would be helpful even more so. How do you feel like you do that in a way that translates so well to women listening?
So one of the things that I have the benefit of doing now that I've had students through my course is I have the birth stories on the podcast. And the majority of them are my essential birth students. And so what'll happen is they'll have a baby and they'll share their birth story in the Facebook group, and I'll read through it and I love it. And so we reach out to them and we're like, hey, this will absolutely serve all these people. How would you feel about being on the podcast? We also have people that reach out to us all the time. Can we be on your podcast? All that kind of stuff. But within that interview, I asked them certain questions like, how did you prepare? Tell me how, like, you and your husband signed up for the birth course at 25 weeks. How did you guys use it and prepare? So it's people are kind of like following along with their journey, and they're like, oh, that would be helpful for if me and my husband went through this together, or we tried this exercise, or they talked about this. Like, I want to know more about that. And then same thing at the end, I asked, what are your I have these like final questions, like what's your best advice for moms, best advice for dads? And a lot of that kind of like ties back into it's the feelings that it initiates in people or that brings up that really like, I don't know. I just feel like feelings are so powerful. And especially when you're sharing something so personal and so sacred, it portrays that for somebody else too. Like they can put themselves in that place and say, that is the kind of experience that I want to have. And so that's one way that I do it. And I do birth stories like every fourth episode. And I do them because I love them and I want to share birth stories with the world. I think it's so useful and so beneficial. And it's also a great place I don't have to say a thing about the birth course because we're talking about it in between, and I don't have to bring people on. The other thing that I do though is I will do dynamic ads. We kind of talked about that. So like if I have Mother's Day coming up or Black Friday, those are kind of like the two big ones, like a spring, fall kind of thing. I do, I'll throw those in there like Mother's Day bonus, and you get these 3 bonuses when you guys sign up by this time, and then we extend it. And so that brings people in that way. That's certainly a way I do it. And then the other way that you've probably heard me talk about it is, I'll read testimonials that include like, and I bought the birth course and I love it. So that's helpful. But I'll just be talking about, different topics and kind of like, even anytime during the episode or even towards the end, it'll be like, and I would love to give you even more information about this. Like, come join me in the birth course where it's my best work and it's all organized and pretty for you and ready to go. And so it's not so much like you're right. I really do try to not be salesy about it or like really in your face. Like I really do want to serve people and have them feel like it's this natural next step. So that is intentional. So I'm glad that you said that. But yeah, that's kind of how I do it.
Yeah. And those are like 3 really great ways. I mean, case study content is really what you were saying with those birth story episodes. Like, so if we were translating that to like, you're having students on, which that could be a student for someone listening who has a like B2B course or another type of business to consumer course like yours, but it's like, it's what you're doing is you're having students on. But the whole point of the episode is not to be like, look how great this product is. It's like they're telling their story and that just kind of naturally comes out, which makes it really engaging for listeners. You have to be careful with case study content because sometimes it can go too hard one way. And like, I don't know, I've experienced before of like, wait, is this selling the product enough? And then also like, wait, we're only talking about that too much. Yeah, I love that. And then dynamic ads, like for people who don't know what that is, you want to explain it just to like what dynamic ads is and how you're using it?
Sure. And I don't use it a ton, but dynamic ads are great because you can do either a like pre-roll, mid-roll, or post-roll ad. And then once you launch the dynamic ad, so say that I record an ad and I upload it and I said, I want 2 of them. I want pre-roll and mid-roll. Then I make it live and that becomes the pre-roll and mid-roll for all of the podcast episodes on my podcast. So instead of what we used to have to do was make an ad and upload it specific, however many podcasts you want it on, it just blankets them. And so you can turn it on when you, like my Mother's Day sale, I turn it on for 2 weeks and then I turn it off when it's done and they disappear and it's wonderful. So, I mean, benefit to that, but there's also probably like if you want something specific to an episode that you're talking about, you want that ad to stay there, then maybe you would add it specific to that episode. But the dynamic ads are great.
Yeah. And the quickly turning on and off and like through, I think the biggest thing for me with dynamic ads is like the fact that people do go back and listen to old episodes, whether it's like 20 episodes ago or people are going back to episode 1, but you can talk about something current in your business, like Stephanie's saying with the Mother's Day sale, like to someone who's listening to an episode that aired like 5 years ago. Literally, you
Yeah.
can still talk about it, the relevant thing. I'll actually put a link in the show notes for Buzzsprout, which is what Stephanie and I both use as our podcast host that allows for dynamic ads. And I switched to Buzzsprout at the end of last year, I think. And I've really loved it. But that was one of the big reasons I switched was dynamic ads. And you shared too that you're sharing testimonials at the beginning of episodes from listeners, like you share a podcast review. Tell me a little bit more about that, like, and how you think that translates to getting people more interested and like involved in the community.
Yeah, the fun part about reading testimonials, and so I tell people, jump onto Apple Podcast and go here, scroll here, click here, write this, and I would love to read it on the episode. And the fun part about that is it involves your listeners. And so especially early on when you're just getting started and maybe you have like 15, 20 people, 100 people that are listening, if one of those people puts it on there and they hear that the next time, they're like, oh my gosh, she said my name on the air. Like, how cool is that? Which is always funny too. Like, don't you think it's funny? I mean, I don't know. Like, I'll talk with people that have like, oh, I met you on the podcast, or I'll interview people. I'll end up like on a Zoom call with them that they're my students now or whatever. And they're like, oh my gosh, I feel like I'm talking to a celebrity. And you're like, I am just a mom behind the computer screen. Like half the time I don't know what I'm doing. Like I promise. But it really does, like, it gives them that like, I am so special feeling. So I mean, I love it. I have kept with it the entire time we've done the podcast. I have read testimonials.
Yeah. And like, yeah, you have, just a reference too, you have over 652 reviews on Apple Podcasts, which, y'all, it's hard to get people to review your podcast. Like Stephanie's saying, she's asking people, telling them how to do it. A lot of people don't even know how to like find it. And honestly, like Apple doesn't make it that easy. Spotify, you can't even write anything. It's just like a star rating right now, at least. And so, yeah, asking people, but like, I love how you're doing the ask alongside giving the person a shout out, which does incentivize people more. And I remember when you gave my review a shout out. So it's like, it is like a fun thing when you listen to something. I was like, oh my gosh, like that's my review. So yeah, I think that's a really smart, especially for like a business to consumer type of podcasting course. Another question for you though about your podcast, because you do, like you said, you're like close to 300 episodes. You really dive deep on it into like really helpful information outside of needing to buy your course about pregnancy and birth. Have you ever been concerned that you're giving away too much on your show to where people might feel like, oh, I don't even need the course, I can just listen to Stephanie's podcast? Is that ever an issue?
I really worried about that early on. That was a legitimate fear that I'm like, oh my gosh, like I had said, 6 episodes and I've said all the things and I don't know, I'm out. But I do think when you are offering value to somebody's life, I mean, the benefit of taking any course, right? Like you can get all the freebies and listen to all the podcasts of whoever's talking. The benefit of having a course is you have it lined up in the exact order that you're supposed to take it, easy, step by step, and you can come back to it as you need. And so I did have that fear in the beginning, but as time went on, I realized, I mean, you could talk about birth or anything with anybody's course all day long. Even if you do give away all the content over time, someone is going to be really, really happy that you put it in a perfect order and they don't have to go through, hundreds of podcasts or blog posts or emails to figure out exactly what they're talking about. I hope that by the time people take my birth course, they have some kind of education that they've learned along the way that's going to make you feel that much more confident. But the truth about it is, no matter what you're learning, if it's good content, you're going to have to listen to it over and over and over again. And I know that because even as I learn new things, like right now I'm in the depths of like learning all kinds of stuff about nutrition. And I'm like, man, you forget, and I'm taking a course, right? You forget that like you have to hear it like 10 times before it just becomes part of your what you think about when you're thinking about a certain topic. So I did worry about that. I don't worry about that at all anymore. I will tell you quite honestly, I have had probably 1 or 2 people who have said that to me. Like, I feel like I learned everything that I needed to on the podcast and I didn't need this course. And so I will say, like, you might absolutely get those people. The other, like, 99.9% of people that have taken the course have been like, that was so awesome. And thank you so much. So don't get hung up when people have their opinions about things. and don't let it take you down, because it's just going to happen, right? Like there's just no perfect way around that. So yes, it has happened even, and it still is totally fine.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right that in reality there will be people who decide that like I'm just here for like finding the freebies, which would be like free podcast content or even like freebies on your website, and they're like that's it. But then yeah, the majority of people who are really like consuming the content the way you're hoping are going to be more interested in buying and might be waiting for a sale or something like you were saying with running promotions during the year. Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, I have a few more questions for you. One thing I wanted to ask about is, when we think about the flow, right, of people ultimately becoming a customer, they often start with your podcast. Some people might go straight from the podcast to buying the birth course or postpartum course, but then you also have a lead magnet. You say you're making another one, but like for all these years, I think you've only had one main lead magnet that is your 3 exercises cheat sheet. It's like exercises to do during pregnancy to help with birth. What's your strategy from an email marketing perspective once people sign up for that freebie to ultimately talk to them about the birth course?
Yeah, so we have a welcome sequence. And so that just means that when somebody gives me their email and they get that download, then they send them through a series of emails that they get over a designated amount of time. And so that sequence has changed over time. I don't know how long ago you got it, but at first, maybe it was like we sent the first email, and then within 24 hours, we sent you another one. And then we sent you one 3 days later, and then 2 weeks later, right? So we had like a system of how many touch points we were going to have from this one download. And then it also, should somebody choose to subscribe, they're now getting the weekly content that we're sending out every week. And that content for myself is what we talked about on the podcast that week. So I have like my main content that I talk about on the podcast, and then my touch point with my customers is every week, where I'm giving kind of some background with that or something fun that goes along with it, something that's going to touch them, relate to them, and then a link so that they can listen to the podcast. But for that welcome sequence that used to be, so many touch points over so many weeks, now you download it and you get a freebie and an email and a video every single day for a week. And it even has its own kind of like mini sales page now, right? Where it says something like this workbook, worth $47, totally free, download it here, content available, freebies available. And so we include like there's an audio guide that goes with it now. There's a video guide that goes with it. You get just different downloadables in the way of like cheat sheets or whatever we have for that week. And then it also puts them into that weekly email. So whenever they get it, they're also getting like now they get to hear from us on the podcast or whatever else. So, but people love freebies. Like it doesn't matter if it's something big or something small, but like free downloadable, whatever, or free, it's just fun to get free stuff. So that's kind of what it does right now, but it's a week.
Yeah. And I love that too, how yours, yeah, I've noticed that actually. I was on your website the other day before this interview and like looking at you've done up the freebie more. Like there's more stuff people get with it, which I think is really cool. But I also think it's cool that you're mainly pushing, I know you might add more, but it's like one thing being pushed generally from the podcast. So it's like you are pushing like, hey, you can directly go buy the birth course, or you can get this free cheat sheet with these exercises that'll help you prepare for birth. Because both of those are really enticing and maybe enticing to different people. Do you feel like you talk about the freebie on most podcast episodes, or are there plenty where you're just like, this isn't something I need to mention?
I don't talk about it on most podcast episodes, and that's actually something that I think I could be better at. I do think I probably need to mention it more. Even now, years into podcasting and having a business, I get nervous about overselling. Like I don't want to be the sleazy salesman. I don't want to. I want people to love it because they love it. So yeah, I could definitely use some time to talk about that. But I was going to say the other thing that I do offer with a lot of my podcast episodes, and you probably heard it on there, is I do have different downloads. So there are different opt-ins that people can dive into, if you want. And we have them on like a link tree on Instagram. Like there are other places as well, like hospital tour questions or questions to ask your provider or the find it and flip it exercise. I'll have these different things. And two, when I have guests on, I'll say, hey, we love to give away a freebie to our listeners. What do you have in like a PDF format? It can have all of your branding and everything else that we can make available for download on our site for email capture. And so people will give us freebies. Now that can be tricky if you want to talk about like back end of courses and stuff and how many opt-ins you can have before you have to start paying more money to have more opt-ins on your site. But basically, then you have somebody, it's like a really easy touch point. You don't have to even download the guide. You just, oh, yeah, I would love a list of questions. And so they go, they give the email address, and now they're subscribed to that weekly content. So now maybe they forgot about the podcast after they listened to that random one and got the freebie, but now it shows up in your email the next week. And so that's another opportunity. And then we'll have, emails that will say, sometimes it'll even say at the bottom, like, hey, have you downloaded the guide yet? Which we try not to do that with people, obviously, who already have, but there's things like that on there too.
Yeah, that's cool about the having a guest contribute something. When you do that, like say the guest provides a freebie and it goes on your website, do they also get the email captured? Like y'all both are getting the email addresses, or is it just you getting it or just them getting it?
It's just us. So there have been some,
Okay.
if they tend to be like higher profile people, like they have a lot more followers or something like that, or a way bigger email list than I do, I won't necessarily bug about that too much, or maybe they're not willing at that point to hand something over for our email list. Most of the time they really are, though. Like it really has not been that big of a deal. And that's when I say, like, make sure it can be your branding. It can have links within it that lead directly to your website.
Yeah.
So there is that, but no, we do ask that it's for our email capture. And that's actually something I learned early on from another podcaster that was her recommendation. And I thought that was pretty good.
Yeah, that's really smart because I feel like a lot of times we assume that it's like you need to ask, like, hey, do you have a freebie at the end? And then it's just like the person shares their domain name with some freebie. But it's like, yeah, like put it on your website. And then they are also getting promoted because, like you said, you're allowing them, if it's like a PDF, to have links in it and whatnot. I really like that as a strategy. Yeah. Okay, Stephanie, this has been so helpful. I have a question for you about motherhood. But before I ask you that, I'm curious if you have like any last thoughts for someone who is maybe a service provider or teaching like in-person classes like you were, and they're thinking about moving into online courses and moving into podcasts, like just any like final thoughts or advice for them.
It probably is just dependent on where you're at in your life. It made sense at that time for me to push things to an online platform, even though at the time, to be able to do that, I had to give up what I was currently doing to being able to bring in money for my family. So there's certainly sacrifices to be thinking of. But if you have a service that will benefit many, many people, and this is your way of being able to do that, like in a bigger platform, then yeah, I think, like, why not go for it? Don't go into debt over it. That if you can start small and see, I don't know, I feel like that's the big thing I want to say to like all women is you have so much to offer. You probably don't realize it. We all like rank ourselves here when we really do have a lot to give. So if you feel like you have a service that can really benefit other people, yes, I highly recommend going for it.
Yeah, I love that. You're such a good example of going for it. Like your business is just awesome. And I love watching you get to serve women so well and like seeing kind of like as another business owner, the behind the scenes of like how all that's going. Cause it's really cool. Okay. What does motherhood and work look like for you in this season? Cause like, I know you're a homeschool mom, lots of kiddos. So kind of curious if you could just share any like kind of what your work life looks like, and then any advice for other moms listening who are balancing business and motherhood.
Yeah, this season, I'm glad that you said that because it's so different from where I started, 5-7 years ago. And this season, I have 4 teenagers and one who will be a teenager in another year and a half. So we're just full blown crazy. And I know that you and I talked about this recently, but we did just adopt 2 of our nieces. So that's where the 5 comes from, because I have 3 boys and then now we have 2 girls. And so I really had to decide this last year, where's my time and energy going to be spent? And so for a while, I completely backed away from my business. I do have 2 incredible virtual assistants, and their hours have fluctuated. I have one right now that, I don't know, it's probably like 5 to 10 hours that she does in a 2-week period. And the other is a good like 10 to 20 hours in a 2-week period. But that varies depending on what we need. And so when I had to back away, it was really nice to say, okay, you guys take over all of this stuff and I am just going to be podcasting. That's really what I was doing at that time. And because my business had been built up well, it has been fine. It really has kind of like carried through, and I've been able to step back and be mom and homeschooling and all of that kind of stuff too. Now I'm feeling like I'm ready to ramp up again. I'm ready. I'm, working on these course updates. We're really close to re-recording now, and we're going to push all of that back out. I'll probably be scheduling another consulting call with you, right? As we're like looking at, should I change my branding and maybe this template and, all that kind of stuff as it comes back out. But yeah, I like, as I'm sharing right now, we're in summer and it's like I'm working a good 40 to 50 hours right now and completely ignoring my kids. I can hear them in the other room. I make sure that they're fed. We do scriptures together, but like they know mom's working for a bit. And then as school is coming back up and we're talking about homeschooling, and I have 3 in high school this year, we're going to have to focus a lot of time on making sure that they have what they need. Something that's really neat though is the oldest girl is actually totally considering becoming a midwife. And so I'm like looking at my life, coming full circle. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like how cool is this? So we're talking about how do we graduate early and get started on these prereqs and, make sure we have a car and a license so that we can do these things. So the conversation changes over time. But what I love about having an online business is it can fluctuate with me as they need it. There's some weeks where I really can like work 5 hours for the week, 10 hours for the week, and it's totally fine. And then there's other times where it's like, yeah, I have time and I'd like to work 30 hours this week and really, push through with some of these things. So it's so flexible. It's that, I mean, that's the best part of it. Being your own boss and working from home. That's the best part. You still get to be mom.
Yes. Well, yeah, you're right that your business, we have similar businesses in so many ways, but it's like when you're selling products and you built it up to a certain point, you can just do the thing you do best, which for you, you're saying like when you're not building a new product, which now you are, but like it could be that you're just showing up and you are being Stephanie recording the podcast, and then there are other things being taken care of behind the scenes. So you can kind of just focus on that one thing. Then when you make new products, it can be like back to like a more hustle season. Of doing like, updates on products or new things or whatever it is. Yeah. I love that though. And love how, yeah, I mean, you're such a good example. I feel like I could ask you a million mom questions. I'm going to stop. So we can, I don't take too much of your time, but yeah, like, it's so cool watching you do that too. And with homeschooling, I'm like, your hands must be so full, but full of good things. And yeah, really cool that your business like fits into all that so well. Okay, Stephanie, this has been wonderful. For people listening, thanks for listening all the way to the end. But also we'll put info about this in the show notes, but Stephanie and I are doing a giveaway together. And this is the first time she's ever done this. Y'all, she loves Breakthrough Fam podcast listeners, but she's giving away her birth course to one listener of this episode. We will put information about that again it'll be an Instagram giveaway, but we'll put info in the show notes. So as you're listening to this, just go to show notes and click the link about that. And I will also be giving away with that. So we're giving away Stephanie's birth course and a one-on-one consulting call with me where we could talk about starting a business if you don't have a business yet, or about, maybe planning a maternity leave, planning things to make your business more friendly to having a baby, maybe added to the mix if you are pregnant and giving birth soon. So anyway, we're excited about that giveaway. Thanks for so generously doing that, Stephanie. And can you tell everyone though about where they can find you, connect with you, and all your stuff?
Yes. So you can come listen to me on the podcast, which is Pregnancy and Birth Made Easy, anywhere that you listen to podcasts. The website is myessentialbirth.com, and we've got freebies and courses and all of that stuff. And then all of the social media is at My Essential Birth. So that's TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Stephanie. This was so fun.
Yes, I agree. Thanks for having me, Liz. You're amazing.